Hey everyone, my name is Manny Espitia. My pronouns are he, his, him. Welcome to our panel today and claim your seat. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. We're just going to let folks trickle in first. All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Claim Your Seat, the realities of running as a disabled and neurodivergent candidate. My name is Manny, and I'm the Northern Regional Director at Run for Something, and we are here tonight with our partner, the National Council on Independent Living. And for this webinar, we are using the Zoom live transcription services. If you would like to view live captions on your screen, please click the More menu in the lower right-hand corner and select Show Subtitle. We also have Shelley and Gay from Languagers as the ASL interpreter for tonight's webinar. One of the most rewarding aspects of Run for Something is to recruit and support amazing, diverse candidates to run strong grassroots elections. I know that there are many current and future candidates on this call, so it is my pleasure to be your co-host for tonight's event. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Please introduce yourself in the chat box. Make sure your settings are set to everyone and share your name, where you are, and what brought you to the call this evening. And feel free to use the chat box to comment on the program or interact with other attendees. This is a great chance to get to know people and help build community. After initial discussion with our panelists, we will open up the floor to questions. So please put any questions you have for the panel in the Q&A box. We will pull questions from there, not from the chat box. And later during the call, we'll launch a poll. So if you'd like to take the next step in working with Run for Something, you'll be able to opt in. Okay, we have with the housekeeping covered, let's get into the program. Again, we're so glad to have you and discuss what might be a run for office as a disabled and neurodivergent candidate. Whether you are running in 2022 or are thinking about running in the future, we hope this conversation tonight will help you think through how your lived experiences impact your work as a candidate and as a community member. To put it bluntly, we need more disabled and neurodivergent people running for office and getting elected across this country so that your experiences are reflected in the decisions we make in leading our communities. Tonight, our panel represents a range of identities and experiences and certainly doesn't represent the entire disabled and neurodivergent community experience. Tonight's call is a place for us to come together as a political community invested in candidates from all walks of life to provide honest advice, answer questions, and create a community of support that you need when you are stepping up to run for office. Before I pass the program to our moderator and panelists this evening, I want to take a moment to review what Run for Something is all about. We encourage young, diverse progressives to run for local and state office. More specifically, Run for Something endorses diverse progressive candidates who are 40 and under, running for the first or second time, running for down ballot offices, which include city council, mayor, county commission, state legislature, school board, county clerk, sheriff, or district attorney, and more. And since Run for Something started in 2017, we have identified more than 110,000 young people who want to run for office and have endorsed over 2,000 all-star candidates in all 50 states. To date, Run for Something has elected 643 candidates to state and local office in 48 states, and our winners are 56% women, 58% people of color, and 21% LGBTQIA+. We also provide coaching for our endorsed candidates to support you through every phase of your campaign. We provide resources, trainings, and connect candidates with partners who can help their campaigns. We also work with our alumni to support current candidates and to make connections that will help them govern successfully once elected. We do this because we know that more young, diverse, and exciting progressives running strong grassroots campaigns across the country will increase immediate turnout for Democrats up and down the ticket and will help build political power for underrepresented groups across this country. And it will also change the conversation about who is electable in this country. At Run for Something, we focus on local, county, and state offices because these elected leaders directly influence people's everyday lives. So we truly hope this call will either help you in your run or convince you to consider running in your community. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Sarah Blahovec from the National Council on Independent Living.
Hi, everybody. It's good to see so many people joining us tonight. My name is Sarah Blahovec, and my pronouns are she and her. I am with the National Council on Independent Living. And for those who aren't familiar, National Council on Independent Living, also called NCIL, is a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization that works on cross-disability advocacy issues. I work on voting rights and civic engagement there, and am the creator of Elevate campaign training for people with disabilities, which is the first and still currently the only campaign training specifically focused on accessibility and a disability inclusive curriculum. I know we'll be dropping links in the chat to that, but that resource is out there for folks who are interested in learning a little bit more about running for office, as clearly the folks on this call are tonight, since that is what this is all about. You know, it is ADA Anniversary Month or Disability Pride Month, whatever you want to call it. We're coming up on the 32nd anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it is certainly a challenging time. I'm trying not to step out of the bounds of my nonpartisan role at NCIL here, but certainly a time where a lot of people are thinking, what can I do to affect change in the community for people like me, for my community members, to make sure that we have a society that is that protects and values all of us. So it's really important to have disability representation in elected office from people who believe in the programs and the laws that give us our civil rights. And so I'm really excited to hear from our panelists this evening about their experiences running for office, and to learn a little bit more about their thoughts on it, what motivation they have, and their experiences they had, so that the folks who are just starting to consider running for office can you know, get an idea of what it may be like for them. So with that, I am going to briefly introduce our panelists here. So first we have Ian Shadrick, who is a former candidate for Jefferson City Board of Education in Missouri. He's experienced in disability and blind rehabilitation services, counseling, and public health. As a person with low vision and a parent of 2 children who are deaf and hard of hearing, he understands the importance of access. And Ian currently works at a blind rehabilitation specialist, at Walter Reed Military Medical Center. Sarah DeStasio, our next panelist, is a Democratic socialist who ran for Olympia City Council. She is queer, disabled, and a member of the religious left. Sarah co-founded Capital Home Care Cooperative, a worker-owned caregiving agency, after serving her community as a caregiver for many years, and is currently completing her master's in counseling internship at a community mental health center. Representative David Ortiz serves as in the Colorado House representing District 38. He is a wounded veteran and lifelong public servant. While deployed, he survived a crash that left him paralyzed from the waist down. Because he has had access to quality and affordable health care, David regained his independence and continued his public service in Colorado. And finally, Matt Hughes serves on the Hillsborough Board of Commissioners in North Carolina and recently ran for the North Carolina House. A native of Orange County, Matt ran to represent hometown interests, believing North Carolina has suffered a lost decade due to reactionary conservatives in the legislature. So I'm going to start with our first question to the panel, and I will start actually with Matt. This is going to be for everyone, but starting with Matt, tell us about the moment that you imagined yourself running for office, and what was that like?
Well, it's very interesting. In my community in Orange County, North Carolina, it's a very affluent, very well educated community. And most of our elected officials, at least at the time, were also white, and much older. So my first run for office was for the Board of County Commissioners the year before Run for Something existed. And so it was highly unusual to have a 25-year-old running for a board that was mostly dominated by 60 plus year olds, and in a community that was extremely young, because we're home to the University of North Carolina, and we're also not that far from Duke University. I kind of always imagined running for office, but like a lot of things, you don't always plan when you want to run for office or when running for office will be a thing for you. In that case, and honestly, in the other times that I've run for office, it has come because of a retirement that afforded me the opportunity to seek a seat, whether that was on the Board of County Commissioners, for the county, for the Board of Commissioners for my hometown where I currently serve, or for the state legislature. So things can be unpredictable, but I believe very deeply that if you have a public servant heart, then you're always ready to jump in. And if that's the way that you're committing yourself and showing yourself in the community.
Great, thank you. Next, David, what was it like whenever you considered running for office?
Yeah, so I like to say that I always imagine myself advocating and being involved in policy, and that came to fruition after my injury. I became a lobbyist for veterans in Denver and in DC, but it was someone else, and else's, the community, that helped me imagine myself running for office. I was recruited to run for office by State Senator Pedersen, that's now running for Congress. She was at a mental health forum that I had organized and hosted for veterans, and we had 70 plus veteran and non-veteran leaders there. She looked around and she was like, "Hey, have you ever thought about running for office?" And I told her, no, I have not. And I enjoy the work that I'm doing now. And like any BA empowered woman that knows she's right, she was like, you know what? Don't answer right away. Talk to the community, talk to the important people in your life and in my life. And in a month or two, come back with an answer. And everyone in the community had such an outpouring of support. We were a red seat that stayed red in 18 by 374 votes. It was a 60-plus-year-old white man. And because of the story and the advocacy in the community, we were able to flip it by over 7,000 votes. So it was really the community that stepped up and pushed for me to run for office because they wanted representation that reflected their values.
Thank you for that. Sarah, what about you? What was it like for you to consider running for office?
Well, this is a little bit of a funny story. I always imagined that I'd run for office, but it was always later, 10 years, 20 years. And shortly before I decided to run, I was co-chair of the local chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. And, not only were we doing already really serious political work, but also through that organization, I was getting these profound social connections, community connections, friendships. So I was day drinking on the patio of one of those people. And this was January 2021. And she looked at me and she said, "We don't have anybody to run yet for city council." And that was true. There were no socialists in the race at that time. There was no one who would represent our politics. And that was the moment, that was the first moment I considered it, doing it that year. And that was the moment that I decided. And incidentally, that woman is Jessica Ryan, who's now the co-chair of the local chapter. So full circle there.
Great. And Ian, when did you consider running for office? What was that like?
So similar to my fellow panelists, I've been involved in policy at various levels as both a service provider and also as an administrator, so always been pretty interested in policy, had an interest in running, but hadn't really considered, when that might come. And realistically, the thing that spurred that for me was at the start of the pandemic, was the way that my local area was handling the pandemic, in addition to the fact that my school district essentially wasn't handling the pandemic very well. We were getting a lot of back and forth. And in addition to that, there were a lot of issues surrounding disparities with curriculum, as well as students with disabilities and various other factors that I just felt like that was kind of the opportune time to try and jump in and make the difference.
Great, thank you. So Ian, continuing kind of, with your journey there, whenever it came to being a person who has low vision, who has a disability, how did you frame that in your campaign story? We talk a lot about story of self and how you're kind of advertising yourself. I don't know if advertising is the best word, but how you're portraying yourself to the community, what your values are and reasons for running. So how did your disability come into play in that narrative?
So in some ways, my disability was less of an issue than what I might have either anticipated or as people might perceive, partly because I was coming at it from the perspective of as an educator and a counselor, and bringing that perspective to a school board, because we were in a situation where there's not been an educator on that board in at least the last 20 years. But relative to disability, that was one of the things that, of course, I did bring to the table. So I was able to discuss that perspective with regard to access, with regard to communication. But I'm also one of those people who, realistically, my low vision is the least of my disability conditions. So my autoimmune conditions during the pandemic were actually more of a concern and more of an issue, and a way to kind of frame how the district was handling that, as well as the communication aspects surrounding that and involvement with parents.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I'm someone as well who has an autoimmune disease. And so it's certainly been interesting to see how that plays into kind of the COVID pandemic and how we move forward in all aspects of life and civic engagement as well. I say that as someone who just got a jury summons today, and I'm not sure how I'm going to do that as an immune compromised person. So yeah. So Sarah, with your first run for office, what are some of the really important things that you wish you had known in your first run that maybe you didn't know at the time, either specific to disability or just in general?
So one thing that I thought about with this was how I didn't anticipate how important it would be to connect with local community leaders and leaders in local political organizations. That may seem obvious, but when I started out, I didn't realize that gaining the support of, for instance, the local Democratic Party chair was going to be instrumental in what endorsements I got, and also, as it turns out, in whether or not I got advocacy around my disabilities. Because some of those community leaders really stepped up to help me get the kind of accommodations I needed. And we'll likely talk about this later on. But as an example, for endorsement interviews in my community, it's not common practice to give questions ahead of time. That's actually pretty unheard of, but it's something I absolutely needed to be successful. And so that person and others were able to advocate for my behalf and say, hey, she's not faking it. She's not trying to get a leg up, but she needs these questions a week in advance to be able to answer them effectively because of her cognitive limitations. So that was one powerful thing that I learned. And something else was, at least in my race, in my city, maybe it's different in Chicago or LA, but it's better to reschedule than to try to power through something when you're sick. And that's something that I didn't know at the beginning and that I learned very quickly.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's something that is challenging in campaign environments in general, because there's this kind of, work hard, put everything else out of your life during campaign season. That is something that a lot of us can't do, especially whenever folks are saying, that's the way we have to win, is just kind of push through everything. But we have more sustainable, whether it's advocacy or campaigns, when we actually give people the grace to be able to reschedule things and to take care of ourselves, because we're not going to get very far if we end up burning ourselves out trying to push through every illness or bad thing going on. Representative Ortiz, how did you address any bias or stigmas attached to disabled candidates and elected officials? Is that something that even came up in your campaign, at first? Because I've talked to candidates who have had nothing come up about disability, and then I've had ones who have faced a lot of barriers and stigmas as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's not smart baseball to directly go after someone for their disability. Although my Republican opponent did during a meeting, which I saw an outpouring of donations, and actually two of his funders that were going to do fundraisers for him dropped out. And you made the comment, well, I don't understand why Rep Ortiz deserves automatic support, so he dropped a helicopter on himself. So normally it's bad strategy to go after someone for their disability, but we all here know that the stigma is there. And so my very first experience at the state capitol as a lobbyist for veterans was standing next to a senator, and I'm not going to say his name because he's a brother veteran and he's a friend now. But he looked at me and he was like, "What'd you do to yourself?" And that's the attitude that people often approach us with. Like, why are we this way? What did we do to ourselves that put us here? So, when it comes to how I fight that bias, there's always, I'm a big nerd. So I think of everything coming in threes, like the Triforce, right? You live by example, you fight tenaciously and tirelessly, and you educate when you can. So that means as soon as it looked like I was going to win, fighting to make sure that the renovations at the state capitol so it could be accessible. I was the only legislator elected that, by the nature of who they were, could not do their job because the state capitol was inaccessible. So that's one of the ways that you combat it. And don't feel bad for advocating. There were some of my peers at the very beginning that thought I was coming in too hot when it came to advocating and fighting for access. And they don't know what it's like. So just never shy away from fighting tenaciously and being unapologetically yourself. These aren't special accommodations. Our access, our basic access, is a human right, period, and everyone gets to live without it being a second thought. So like the height or width of a door, nobody thinks about that for a leg walker, but for us it's considered a special accommodation. So really it's just being loud and proud and being out there as often as you can, and fighting tenaciously and living by example, and educating those that genuinely want to be educated. And for those that are being willfully ignorant, making an example of them.
Yeah, I think that's really, that hit on quite a few points. I know of candidates who, there are some conditions or some disabilities, I'll say, where there might be a little bit more stigma on the campaign trail. I can think namely of anything around, cognitive disabilities and how those can be stigmatized, and mental health conditions, where there's this whole, people with mental health conditions are not unfit for, or not fit for elected office, that you'll sometimes hear. So there are certainly ones where I think it's more normalized in politics to hear stigma versus some other ones. But I will also say that, there are some people who have gotten, a lot of support from their parties, and there are some where even the parties that are supposed to be supporting them have been, posed barriers to getting, say, an interpreter for a candidates forum. And there's just a lot of work that they have done to educate their parties and supporters on why these accommodations are necessary. And I think it's really important to have, it's one of those things where you have more people running for elected office with a disability, serving an elected office with a disability, it becomes more normalized, and fighting for those accommodations will become easier. Yeah, so let me see, getting off track here. What's the next question? For Matt, for you, what do you think are the biggest challenges for neurodivergent candidates, and how did you navigate those challenges?
Yeah, I think neurodivergence can mean a lot of things. And so for me, I'm high functioning autistic. I also have ADHD as well, which is come to find out something that, if you have one, if you're high functioning autistic, you also run with other sorts of neurodivergence, including, ADHD being one of them. And really dealing with both of those, I have a lot of anxiety and depression. So, for me, one of the things that I really realized is that being able to talk about those things is very important, and being authentic about those things. And, it feels kind of weird to come out, but I feel like it's important that people know what you're dealing with, and whatnot. And, part of it is it's been more helpful. I've had people tell me that they thought I was a jerk the first time they met me, but really it's something, I just I'm not neurotypical, right? So my mannerisms, my speech, my train of thought, how I socially interact with folks can be a little awkward. And usually at first when I tell people, it's kind of like, but you can be funny, or you can, you hang out with groups of people and whatnot. And so it's really kind of like an educational type of situation where, you have to tell people there's a spectrum. That's why it's called autism spectrum disorder. You have to do a lot of things, because in their mind, someone who's autistic may, you don't always meet what they think the concept in their mind of what an autistic person is like, or what they are, what they're about. And there is a range out there. But then, then it's kind of like, well, that's kind of cool. Now I know why you can spot off, all these political facts, or why you can remember your board packet backwards and forwards. Or, to me, it's kind of a gift. Even if it does sometimes make it hard to, build connections very quickly. It takes time for me, and that sort of thing. But I think that the more people talk about those things, when I came out, I immediately had, parents of kids, or they're not, some of them are adults, but, parents coming to me, in my DMs and be like, oh my gosh, this resonates, you give me so much hope that, my kid can also aspire to do, really good things. It's not going to hold them back. But I feel like it's important because it can be something that is invisible to a lot of people, if you don't meet the stereotype in their mind of what someone who's neurodivergent may look like.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I have a lot of friends who have spoken to that as well, whenever it comes to things like fighting for accommodations, and people assuming they do or don't need certain accommodations based on how they view them. And, you're not neurodivergent enough or something like that, to be able to get the accommodations that they need. So speaking to kind of the difference there, and the fact that, what we see in our minds as someone who would fit, say, an autistic candidate, does not actually meet the reality of what someone's lived experience is. And we need to be able to meet their needs as candidates, or come with an understanding and an empathy.
And I would also say what made it easy was to see someone like, Jessica Benham in Pennsylvania get elected and talk about her own, diagnosis as well. And, how she was misdiagnosed. And it wasn't until her 20s. I mean, I was diagnosed in my teens. But, that to me gave me a lot of inspiration. So that was pretty awesome.
Yeah. And I think State Representative Jessica Benham has been endorsed, at least once now by Run for Something. So she's wonderful. back to you, Ian. So run for something, and you touched on this a little bit earlier. Run for something encourages candidates to run for office based on problems that they've observed and solutions that they think will help. So can you talk a little bit more about how that played into your decision to run for school board?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that was really the genesis of why I decided to run. Because honestly, when you asked originally about what we had thought about running originally, I never dreamed that it would be for school board. That was never really at the forefront. But when I saw what was going in my community in terms of particularly the lack of ability to meet all of our students where they were, whether that be our students with disabilities or, students who had other challenges, students who were gifted and talented, all that spectrum and range that's there in a district, my district wasn't doing that. They're also, and it's still a challenge. There's still significant communication challenges with parents, both during the pandemic and now that it's looking a little different at least. But so those were kind of some of the things that I felt like I could bring to that. But also having been an educator, at various levels, everything from pre-K all the way through higher ed, and also working a lot in administration where I've worked on post-secondary transition goals. So seeing the district's data and being able to speak to achievement goals and where they were with that was the other piece that I felt like I could make some difference in. Had some interesting conversations along the way about what the administrators there and the superintendent thought were the real reasons for that. But needless to say, they were fairly biased. But like I said, having had those experiences, I felt like those are things I could bring as a different perspective to the board. In addition to my special ed background, it was interesting because one of the things that came up was people making the assumption that the only reason I were in was because of disability or because of a special ed background, when in reality, that was a group I was fighting for, but it certainly wasn't the only reason I was running. But it was kind of a charge that was levied as, oh, well, you're going to focus too much on that. So that was an interesting process.
Yeah, I think that brings up a good point, because while, disability may play into reasons for running for office, sometimes folks can assume that that's going to be the only reason, or that you will only fight for that part of the community whenever you're going to be fighting for all of your constituents, obviously. So I think that's kind of one of the challenges that comes up when identifying as a disabled candidate, particularly in something like school board, where there can be a very specific focus on special education, or a belief that you're just going to focus on that. So it's certainly important for folks to remember that, like, it's bigger than that, and disability is just one aspect of this. Sarah, you can maybe speak to this in terms of your personal experiences. You had talked about an accommodation you received in terms of getting endorsement questions in time for cognitive processing. But what kind of accommodations or resources can help candidates while running and when elected? And if that's something that you want to talk about in terms of the resources that you experience, because I know whenever it comes to accommodations, that can be very diverse and very dependent on a person's disability and what their needs are.
So some of you in the audience might already have experienced getting accommodations through school or the workplace. But if you don't, if as a candidate, it's going to be the first time that you're trying to get your needs met, I would say, make some noise, make demands, enlist support, and get your needs met, because you may have to go hard to make it happen, as I think many of us know. And in terms of resources, backing up a little bit, I have a constellation of medical conditions that cumulatively are disabling. Some of those are stigmatized conditions, and some are not. And so my mentors said, you can tell people you have seizures, you cannot tell people that you have bipolar, even though bipolar by far impacts my life the least, is the most well managed, and actually is the least disabling, right? Because of that stigma piece. That being said, a really good resource for me as a candidate with mental illness, among other conditions, was the National Alliance on Mental Health and their peer support groups, because you'll experience a huge amount of stress as a candidate. It may be different than any kind that you've experienced before. And you're gonna need to take care of yourself if you wanna win and you wanna serve.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think I find it interesting because, as I said, there are certain conditions where I think they are more stigmatized in general and on the campaign trail, especially when we see political discourse about quote unquote fitness for office. But whenever we're talking about campaigns, campaign environments, and the work that you have to do is so intense that regardless of whether you have a mental health diagnosis or not, it can certainly impact your mental health to be in these situations where you're dealing with long hours and things on the campaign trail. So I think there needs to be certainly more of an openness around mental health in the political environment and campaign environments. David, you have used your platform as an elected official to do many things, including advocate for accessibility and for the disability community. So what has that been like for you? What have you been able to accomplish?
Yeah, it's been intense. Being the first state representative or state legislator, that lives with a physical disability that requires a mobility device. So we've literally changed the landscape at the state capitol. It is the people's house. It should have always been accessible, but finally, now that they're forced to, we're changing the landscape and make it accessible. As far as what we were able to do legislatively, we did 7+ disability rights bills, and we're only allowed to bring 5 forward each. So 7 of them with 3 or 4 first in the nation. And that includes making Title II a federal ADA state law, so lowering the threshold of how we can fight for our access. And Title II, for those that don't know, deals with government entities and services. The part that's first in the nation is we mandated at state level and lower websites, departments, everything must be accessible to our print disabled brothers and sisters using WCAG. And that's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines International as the guidance. So that's what makes that first in the nation. We expanded voter rights for our print disabled brothers and sisters as well by allowing them to use the UCAVA voting system. Here in Colorado, we get to enjoy mail-in ballots, but often our print disabled brothers and sisters do not get to enjoy voting the same way we do because of UCAVA and the systems that they have on their computers already. Now they're able to vote from home in the same way that any Coloradoan can. We did first in the nation right to repair bill, one that deals with those that are on Medicare, and another bill that deals with those on private insurance. So I was really proud of that. Worked in a bipartisan way to stop discrimination for those with disabilities that want to be transplant recipients. So this was happening to the tune of 80% across the country. So really proud of being able to do that. We're creating a commission for our higher ed department and for our higher ed institutions as a whole, with meaningful representation, and identify what services are available, where the gaps are, and how we can close those gaps to make sure we're closing the achievement gap for those higher ed students that live with a disability. The last one I'll talk about is a car rental bill that mandates that if you operate a car rental company in the state of Colorado, you must make your accessible options choosable and reservable on your website. Previously, you had to call a stupid, separate but not equal customer service line to try and get access to hand controls. And then 50 to 60% of the time, you were not guaranteed to have your vehicle ready. So we have really crushed it. The only reason why, though, it's not just because of me, it's because of we have to leverage the power of the community and our allies. Because let me tell you, some of those corporate lobbyists, like New Motion when it came to the right to repair bill, like Enterprise when it came to the car rental bill, we know what they're there for. They're there for their bottom line. And at every turn, they would pretend like they wanted to work in cooperation and collaboration with you, but trying to kill it behind your back every step. So we were able to do a lot. We didn't do it alone. We need to keep uplifting and empowering the community that lives with a disability, because obviously look around the world and it's still not yet made for us. So we have to keep working together and empowering each other so we can keep passing meaningful legislation at all levels like this.
Yeah, That's incredible. And for folks who don't know, UOCAVA, that's a uniform and overseas voters. So in, I believe, 32 states, there is an option for those voters to be able to return their ballot electronically. And that's something that is not available, that's only available in actually 9 states, it should be 10, for voters who have print disabilities, because mail-in voting is not accessible for people who are blind and low vision and can't independently mark a ballot. So that's something that I'm personally very passionate about and very excited to see that legislation pass. But yeah, it's very clear from what folks have said here that really community plays such a big role, whether that's community in terms of the disability community, in terms of building connections or allies to be able to pass legislation, to be able to fight for the accommodations that you need and fight for the support that you need. It really plays a big role. And that's why I'm very excited that Run for Something does events like this, because we can't be doing this in a vacuum, just over in the disability space, doing the disability things. Like, we have to be in all of these spaces, working to connect with people, disabled and non-disabled, to fight for this change. Matt, candidates are often worried about building a team of staff and volunteers, especially whenever it comes to, local campaigns where it is, you might not have a big campaign budget and you have to work, much smaller than, say, something at the state or federal level. So what was your approach to building a campaign team when you were running for office?
It kind of varies. I think that I've run into very competitive elections. My very first one for county commissioner, and then my most recent one for state house. And, in both of those situations, I really kind of leaned in. Sarah was talking about, the local Democratic Party. I really leaned in both of those situations with my connections to the party. My first election, I was the party chair in my county. That had allowed me about 6 years of building donor relationships, of building relationships with potential voters as well as volunteers, and becoming well known within the party apparatus, which I think definitely allowed me to run a fairly close election. There was only about 1,700 votes between me and my opponent out of 30,000 that had been cast. So that's a pretty tight race. And I think that type of connection really helped a lot in my election this year. The election where I was running to retain my seat after being appointed to the town board was a little different. It was a lot less competitive. Hillsborough is a place where you don't do a lot of door-to-door canvassing. You don't do a lot of direct mail, but I don't take anything for granted. So some of my friends and supporters thought it was a little strange to build out a really robust campaign team. But I thought it was very important that we go meet the voters. I don't think that the only time that folks, go knock on someone's door and figure out what's on their mind is when they're in a super contested election. We were in a contested election, but it wasn't highly competitive. We had 3 incumbents running and a newcomer that a lot of folks didn't know who he was, and he really didn't run a campaign. And in a very Democratic town, he was the outlier. He was an unaffiliated, and a lot of my voters are pretty skeptical of unaffiliated candidates. And the 3 incumbents were all Democrats. So, it can vary significantly, but I think that when you're looking to build a campaign team, regardless of how big the election is or how contested the election is or how competitive it is, you really have to lean into, your friends, your family, anyone that you've served on boards with, either at a nonprofit or, local government advisory capacity. really just anyone and everyone. And to me, your team is also the people who are willing to invest in you. You know, it could be that high school friend that you have not seen in 10 years, but you connect through Facebook, and they're willing to send text messages and, you know, send you $50. You know, that's important too. People can find different ways to contribute, and they're not always going to be the ones who are there at every canvassing shift or every phone bank shift. So, you know, I think it just kind of, it depends on the race. It depends on what kind of ground game you are able to do. Obviously, if you're in a more rural area, as my House district was, that takes a different form than my town commission seat, which is heavily dense and super walkable, right? So I don't really think there's a one size fits all solution. I think it really depends on, you know, how deep your connections are in the community, and, you know, what type of buy-in you bring. And oftentimes I think the things that candidates forget is you still have to ask your friends to get involved in your campaign. They're not just going to see your Facebook post or your email. They've got a lot of things going on too. So you have to ask them. You might have to ask them several times, just like anyone else. But that's really what, you know, what's important. And of course, always making sure you have a campaign treasurer, a campaign manager, or someone who can function in those roles to help you out, because you've got to campaign. You cannot worry about yard sign distribution to your volunteers and go talk to voters at the same time. So, you know, you definitely need to be able to delegate, or you're not going to be a successful candidate, no matter what type of race it is.
Thank you for that. So with that, I think I am going to hand it back over to Manny, because I think we're ready for Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And I just want to give a big thank you so far to our panelists who've done an amazing job. Also to you, Sarah, moderating. But I am like taken aback by some of the stuff like that y'all have talked about. So incredibly impressed and proud of all of y'all. And also shout out to Representative Jessica Benham, who couldn't be on this call today, but this is our second time endorsing her. She's one of my favorite human beings. So I'm just really thankful that we're all part of this family. But before we open the floor to questions, and make sure that you drop questions using the Q&A feature, we're going to launch a poll. If you're interested in talking more about your plans to run for office and brainstorming next steps, opt in for a call with a Run for Something volunteer. If you're running for office in 2022 and apply for endorsement, the volunteer call will serve as an endorsement interview. And if you are still thinking about running, the volunteer will ask questions that will help you figure out what to do next. So I think, and if you opt in to speak with volunteer, you'll receive an email from them over the next few weeks to find a time that works for both of you to talk for about 30 minutes about your campaign plans. So while we're waiting for everyone to answer the poll that will come up in shortly, you can also drop any questions for our panelists in the Q&A box. So I think I can launch. I'll launch the poll. Boom. So poll has been launched. You should get something, and I will answer some of the questions that we have in the Q&A. So I think actually this is a question that came up before. Sarah, I don't know if we still have any answer to this question, but it's the question around Social Security and disability benefit. So do you want to go ahead and
I can go ahead and answer that. So someone asked, many Social Security and disability benefit recipients are penalized when they run for office, and what can I advise to them? Unfortunately, for folks who don't know, the way that the Social Security Administration currently functions is they view campaigning for elected office as possibly a sign of medical improvement. It's a very case-by-case thing, but it could be used to take away your benefits. One thing that I can say is that I can't say too much at this point, but I'm hoping that before the end of the month, or I'm pretty certain before the end of the month, there is going to be a legislative solution that's proposed in Congress to address this issue. So it's something that I've been trying to kind of sound the alarm on for a few years, but hopefully it's something that we can get the rules to change. But in the meantime, what I would say is, and I can drop this in the chat, but if you'd be interested in running for office, I would recommend that you reach out to a Center for Independent Living, and they could connect you with a certified benefits planner. And that would be someone who could help talk through what your options are. It's an imperfect solution at this time, because unfortunately it's just a very unfair system, and that's why we need to actually change the system. You know, that's something that you could do in the meantime, is talk to a benefits planner who could help you explore what your options are.
And I would also just kind of piggyback off of that. That is, you know, for a lot of people, they're running for local office, they're running for school board, they're running for town council in a small municipality. And the ironic thing is that that can be viewed as an improvement in your condition, but yet the salary that you collect is oftentimes not even used as proof of income for when you go apply for a credit card or a home loan or things of that nature, unless you're like, and then of course, if you're running for an office that is a full-time job, that only kind of undercuts you that much more in other ways. So thank you for flagging that, Sarah.
Yeah. And I'll say, you know, that's one part of it. Obviously, there is an issue around, you know, if you actually win that office, how will it be applied? You know, if you're actually in elected office, especially if there is a salary. That's where we also have to continue our advocacy around increasing the asset caps on Social Security. There's bipartisan legislation right now to increase that from $2,000 to $10,000 a year, which, you know, is a start. I'll say that. And certainly if we can get it passed in this Congress, I think will be a very big accomplishment. But there's still a lot of advocacy that needs to be done so that people who are on Social Security are able to fully participate in our civic society and many aspects of society, including marriage as well. But that is something that I will certainly, you know, be staying on top of and continuing to advocate for, and will also run for something up to date on as well.
Thanks, Sarah. And next question I have, this is actually from Damilia Valenzuela, who's actually another run for something endorsed candidate, but she's running out in Arizona. She's running Maricopa County, I think, running for school board, one of the school board seats. But did you ever combat people maybe thinking you were lazy, or the fact that you need breaks more than some others? I have been battling this with my campaign, but I don't, because I don't look disabled. And also anyone can jump in.
All right. I'll jump in with that. I think this kind of work is one that lends itself to not creating healthy boundaries, because the needs of the community are endless, especially if you have a servant's heart, like Matt was talking about. If you come to this work with a servant's heart, the needs of the community are endless, and it's really important to set up those boundaries. I mean, from when I first filed to run until a month after my wedding in August of, 2021, I was in and out of the hospital and emergency rooms a dozen times, which was not sustainable. So it's really, really important to set those boundaries. But I also know the ignorance that comes with the disability sometimes. So I always will gather my staff, especially if there's new staff or interns. I'll talk to my peers and I'll say, hey, this is the reality that I live in. This is what that's going to look like for me, just to give context. And we shouldn't have to always explain ourselves. Just to be honest, I don't know if that's a function of ableism, me explaining myself, but that's how I try and combat some of that stigma, saying, hey, this is the reality of what my life has been for the past 2 years. This is how I'm creating healthier boundaries and taking care of myself so I can continue to do the work.
And I would just say, you know, for me, definitely the boundaries thing, and then also taking the time to recharge. And sometimes I felt like I was letting down my fellows. I had campaign fellows. I didn't have interns. I paid college students $15 an hour to go knock doors, right? So, you know, they were giving up something to, volunteer with me. And so, gas and money is how I compensated folks for that. But, I felt bad sometimes when my campaign manager's like, we were supposed to raise like $10,000 in the last couple of days. Like, where's the money? Because she had access to ActBlue. And, part of it was some days, your anxiety can be so high that it's just hard. And not wanting to go knock doors for that very same reason. That's harder to get out of because you've got volunteers you're meeting. But, I would find ways to kind of force myself to do the things that really I probably wasn't ready to do that day. But as David said, it's really hard to take care of yourself during a campaign. It's a lot easier sometimes when you're in office. You have the ability to say no or take some days for yourself. But it can be very draining. And there's nothing more soul crushing than picking up that phone and dialing for dollars, even from people that you know and love, and they're going to give you something, but it's just like not the most enjoyable thing. It's more enjoyable once you get into a groove and people say yes, like that's a big plus. It's an accomplishment. Then you worry about whether or not they're going to actually go into their email and get the ActBlue link. But it is not something that lends itself well to self-care and work-life balance, especially young people who are also usually working, taking care of a spouse, maybe having a family to take care of as well, and that just exacerbates the issue.
I know that feeling about dialing for dollars, and as a fellow candidate / elected, it can be soul draining at times, but listen, we're doing it because we're trying to get people to believe in our vision of our future. So not doing it just because we want, we need some help. We're doing it because we're trying to improve our communities. It still stinks though. Next question I have is from Dion Jones, which is, does running openly with a disability dilute your voice when it comes to issues outside of disabilities? Which, well, I'm like, in my head, I'm like, everything is intersectional, but y'all can go ahead and answer it.
I've had the experience of my perceived credibility being diminished after having disclosed my disabilities. So that's something that can happen. I hope it does not happen to you. That was in a very specific setting. And, overwhelmingly, I'm still involved in many community organizations. Those people know I'm disabled, but I can move in those spaces without my voice being diluted or my perspective being discounted.
I'll chime in and say, you have to kind of be deliberate about that. I mean, there should be no shame in leaning on your lived personal and professional experiences and running things that resonate with what you've already been doing, and that where the power of your story lends itself to making it easier to be passed. So like, there's a reason why I ran 7 disability rights laws, but I also did work for veterans. We also passed $150 million revolving loan fund for affordable attainable housing. We also invested $600 million into the unemployment insurance program, and then also made it easier for workers to access that money. So you really have to go out of your way, I think, to make sure you don't get pigeonholed. But that's why you lean on your peers and you build a good relationship with your peers. Team Democrat, at least in the Colorado State House, is really good at leveraging people's personal and professional expertise, but also sharing the wealth. And so it's given me a lot of opportunities to expand out of what I came to this job with, if that makes sense.
Ian, I saw you unmute yourself too. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, for me, I don't know that it necessarily diluted my personal message or my voice, but it was certainly a perspective that when I did public forums or, radio shows or anything of that nature, there was an assumption, as I mentioned earlier, that it was strictly about, kids with disabilities or special ed need, as to why I was running for school board, when in reality, that's certainly a large perspective and what spurred the initial interest, but it wasn't who I was fighting for. I was fighting for all of those kids. So it was, as David mentioned, it was making that point to bring that to light and to bear as to what the real issues were that I was pushing for outside of disability.
And I was just going to say, I was also able to dovetail a lot of things that I was running on, in particular in my last election for the state house. I sit on the board for, in North Carolina, we call them Partnerships for Young Children, which for the most part are county level organizations that provide a lot of pre-K and early Head Start, pre-K and early Head Start services. And a lot of it is early intervention, getting kids diagnosed early so they can get their services. I was the first person in my community to receive those services from the partnership and then serve on their board. I'm currently their vice president. But I dovetailed that into, my campaign that's also an education issue. It's also a healthcare issue. It's also a prevention of poverty issue. If we can get kids identified, if we can overcome, any sort of deficits they may have going into kindergarten. And those are things that people really understand, because even if their kid may not be, someone who is having social emotional issues, but there are other things going on, that makes them, in an insecure position going into public school. That's something that people can identify with because the need is so great out there. And so, I don't think that kind of diluted my message. I think it, if anything, helped me amplify it, that, this is who you're investing in if we have these sorts of programs. It's your, possibly your next state legislator. It might be your, local council member. And I think that's very powerful.
Awesome, Matt. With that wonderful answers from all of y'all. Next question from Julia is, how can I find other candidates or elected officials who are disabled and or neurodivergent?
Yeah, I can actually answer that. So at the National Council on Independent Living, I do keep two databases. They're really just Excel sheets of candidates and elected officials with disabilities at all levels of government. I want to clarify, this is not an exhaustive list. I go off of everything from people writing in to tell me that they are a candidate, want to be added to the list, from announcements on social media, from combing through the Run for Something endorsements to see who says that they're disabled, and put that information in there. So I will drop the links to that, to both of those in the chat.
Awesome. And does anybody else have y'all made any connections with folks with other candidates similar to y'all?
NCSL has been a good resource for me to connect with other legislators that live with a disability or allies that want to run disability rights bills. And then plus the network that I had before, lobbying for veterans, which one of the cuts of that was, disabled veterans, and the work that I did with Paralyzed Veterans of America. So there's just a lot of different networks that I've tried to lean on to learn from each other and leverage that.
Also, I would like to just say, I feel like it's a community thing. For me, y'all, as a Latino elected, I find people, I just went out and found them. So David, I heard of you before, before we endorsed you, and I was like, yo, it's exciting. Because we literally look for community. So go ahead, Matt.
Well, I was just going to say, I just kind of pulled up the list of, elected officials. So, thank you, Sarah, for putting that in the chat. And, that just reminded me, one of the things that I also had growing up was a speech impediment. And so, it was one of those things that, when President Biden was running for president, to, see him, I can see it because that happens to me as well. When I get tripped up or I'm very excited about something and it's I can't form a word, right? That is right there. It's literally at the tip of my tongue. I'm going to trip myself up. And people were making jokes about President Biden when he was campaigning, or calling into question his mental acuity. And it's like, it just reminded me that there is a president of the United States, or someone running for president, who still struggles with the same thing that I struggled with when I was a kid too. And so having those people be present and talk about those things, I think, is very, very important, because it does reduce those stigmas. So but people have to be willing to come forward and do that, and we all have to do the work to be able to reduce those stigmas.
Next question I have is from Rose. She says, "Hey y'all, I'm super interested in running in the future, but it's pretty scary. I have low vision and struggle with the perpetual awkwardness of not recognizing people's faces on site. Makes for awkward encounters with the public and even with my friends. Also not sure how to canvass/attend campaign events as a person who cannot drive. Any practical advice, or is it more like get some friends to help you and take the leap?"
I would say it's kind of a mix of those two. I certainly struggle with the identification, of people, unless I'm pretty darn close. And even then, sometimes, it can be challenging. So I certainly can understand that. I think helping folks understand that is a challenge, at the outset, when you are in those groups, and, reminding people to introduce themselves, or, let them know that you're, who's there, those kinds of things. And then as far as canvassing, it's certainly, I think, eliciting volunteers and trying to come up with systems to do that in a strategic way plays a huge role in making sure that can get done. It's certainly a challenge as someone who doesn't drive. I can relate to that as well.
Cool. All right. Well, our next question we have, I think we'll do the next two questions and then we'll move. But Reed Madden asked a question regarding advertising/messaging. I'm looking to make a sort of progressive heel turn and be more combative in advocating for progressive policy. Do you have advice on messaging in general?
I didn't quite catch or understand the progressive part, but I will speak to messaging in general. And I think what's helped me is to just be your most authentic self. I think people resonate with that. I guess at the end, either they will or they won't, but I think that is what has helped me the most. And don't be afraid to leverage your story. I guess we in the disabled community always want to be careful to walking that line of being inspiration porny. I think for me, the line is, when I happen to be out and about and someone is like, "Oh, you're so brave." Why? Because I'm eating dinner? Like, what? You know what I mean? But like, some of us have had to overcome and have lived some pretty intense moments. Like for me personally, whether that's surviving a helicopter crash when I was deployed, and then coming to the injury with my own internalized ableism because I lived for 30 years, and being vulnerable enough to the community to own that and said the world wasn't made for us. And this is, the way I've decided to kind of live that service out and to fight for better access, but not just for me, but for everybody, because then you can start aging in place. We talk about universal design, and being able to apply it. But the bottom line is resonate with your own story and help people connect with it and be your authentic self. I think that's what's been most helpful for me.
And that relates to a question that I answered in text, actually. Telling the truth is really important. And not only as it relates to our experiences, but from a policy perspective too. You want your constituents to know who they're getting. and what you're going to support, and also be able to trust you to support those things. And so I think strong progressive messaging has a lot to do with that. If you feel really hostile about landlords, for instance, you should own that and talk about what policies are going to support renters, right? Don't try to hide it in hopes of, getting a particular endorsement. It may work in the moment. It's not going to work long term. If you get elected, you're going to have some very unhappy people at your door.
And I think also we can't lose sight that, almost a fifth of the country has some sort of, disability of some sort. That's a pretty big minority group. And, you have to be able to go out there and talk about how policy actively affects your life, just as, I'm also a person of color. I have to talk about how police affect my community. I'm an LGBTQ person. I have to talk about how, we think we're progressing on LGBTQ issues, and yet you have a Supreme Court justice calling for reviewing precedent that protects LGBTQ people. So, that's a pretty sizable minority group. And if they themselves are not disabled in some sort of way, they know someone who is. And I think we can't lose sight of that there is a sizable number of folks out there who are living with these issues. And maybe it's not always readily apparent that there is a local policy fix. David was mentioning, all these accommodations. A lot of things only have to be provided when you start asking for them. So you don't necessarily think that they exist, and I probably should have had accommodations in school. I was also an honor student, right? So how do you overcome that, because the systems aren't made for you, but someone knows someone out there who's dealing with these issues, and there's just a large community out there. So I don't think it's using it or trying to be trying to use it in some sort of unfair way. It's just talking about how you literally live your life, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Awesome. So I am gonna wrap up. I'm gonna ask a final question from me. I'll take a moment of personal privilege. And I'm gonna ask y'all, these are pretty dark times. It's pretty, with everything that's happening, whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's, what's going on around the country, a lot of bad things happening. So what is like something that gives you joy in your life right now? Something that makes you feel like a little revitalized, it makes you a little happy. I want to share, I just got a cat, and I used to hate cats, but I love my cat. So yeah, so like that to me is giving me joy. But if y'all could share at least just one thing that's giving y'all joy right now.
So I'll say one thing, as someone who's been working to get more people with disabilities running for office, for me, I would say this webinar is giving me a lot of joy. So I've really appreciated hearing folks, and I hope, people take the opportunity to run for office, or to learn more about Run for Something, seek out what information that you would like, any information that you need. I will put the information on Elevate campaign trainings in the chat really quickly. So I would say that's my thing. But also watching Love Island, because it reminds me that British people have trash too. So
I would say what has been bringing me joy. I'm actually in day 2 of a program at Harvard, Senior Executives in State and Local Government. I'm actually here with one of David's colleagues from the State House, Brianna, one of our few trans legislators in the United States. really had a great talk and walk back to our hotel this morning or this afternoon with her. But also, I don't know, I'm a big college basketball fan, so I'm very anxious about all this conference realignment stuff that's going on. But I'm still riding high from my alma mater, the University of North Carolina, beating Duke in the Final Four semifinals. So bragging rights for a century as far as I'm concerned. So, but those are the types of things that I like to do when I'm not doing elected office, getting out in the community, meeting people, watching college sports. Great stress release, as long as it's not a title game on the line.
I'll piggyback off that just because you brought up Reptitone. It's the amazing people that I get to work with and around, whether we're talking about amazing peers like Reptitone. By the way, she also was a huge champion and a co-prime on the Right to Repair bill, or my campaign team with our nerdy inside jokes, talking about the boys, whatever, it is my wife, the amazing people in my life that I get to do this work with that always elevate me and motivate me and give me fire to keep fighting.
And folks, I swear that no one is paying me to say this, okay? But when the question was asked, the first word that came to mind truly was socialism, and then DSA, other organizations like the Freedom Socialists, because there's so much hope and comfort that I've found there. And I truly believe that despite all the darkness there is right now, we will somehow build a better world.
So I would say from a political perspective, certainly seeing the rise and the increase of interest of folks wanting to run with disabilities as something completely non-political. I'm an assistant coach for my kids' baseball team, so seeing my two little boys become rising little baseball stars is fun. So
that's amazing. Well, I am just floored with all of y'all. Y'all are so incredible. And just before we go, I want to thank all the panelists this evening for sharing your experiences and wisdom with us tonight. We also want to thank everyone who participated and asked questions. Everyone on this call will be getting an email from us tomorrow morning with resources from Run for Something to use as you prepare to run for office. And if you opted in to speak with a volunteer, look for an email from them in the next few weeks to find a time to schedule a call to talk about your plans. We need you, and we're here to support you. Thank you, and have a good night. Thank y'all.